Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. I found the first word on a Tuesday morning, written in dust across my bathroom mirror, a single word that made my blood run cold. Watching, not smudged, not random. Perfect block letters like someone traced them with surgical precision. But here's what really got me. I live alone. I've lived alone for 3 years since my divorce, and my doors were locked. My windows were sealed. My security system was armed. So tell me, how does dust arrange itself into words? Before you click away, before you tell yourself this is just another creepy story, let me ask you something. When was the last time you really looked at the dust in your home? I mean, really looked? Because after what happened to me, I can't stop checking. And sometimes I wish I'd never started looking at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the details matter. They always matter, especially when you're trying to convince someone that the impossible happened to you. Now, let me tell you how it all began. My name is Sarah Chen, and I work from home as a freelance graphic designer in Portland, Oregon. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. I'm not crazy, I'm logical, methodical. I notice patterns for a living. It's what I do. I see the spaces between things, the relationships that others miss, the way elements interact to create meaning. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a converted building in the Alberta Arts District. Hardwood floors that creak in 3 specific spots. Large windows that face west, catching the afternoon light beautifully but creating interesting dust patterns when the sun hits at just the right angle. I'd lived there for 2 years and thought I knew every quirk, every shadow, every sound. I was wrong. The Tuesday it started was overcast, typical Portland weather for October. The kind of gray that seeps into your bones and makes you want to stay wrapped in blankets with coffee that's too strong and music that's too sad. I remember because I'd been working on a logo for a local bakery, something warm and inviting to counter the gloom outside. My morning routine was always the same. Coffee at 7, French press, dark roast, 2 sugars. Check emails by 8 while the caffeine kicked in. But always first, I'd brush my teeth. It was the one constant that grounded me, made me feel human before facing another day of client revisions and creative blocks. The bathroom mirror was positioned to catch the morning light from the small frosted window above the toilet. Not ideal lighting for checking your appearance, but functional enough. I'd been using that mirror for 2 years, wiping it down weekly, watching my reflection slowly adapt to living alone again. But that Tuesday morning, when I flicked on the light and reached for my toothbrush, there it was, watching. 7 letters in perfectly uniform block script, each one exactly the same height, spaced with mathematical precision. The kind of lettering I might create in Illustrator when I needed something clean and readable. But this wasn't digital, this was dust. Ordinary household dust, arranged in a way that defied every law of physics I understood. My first thought was practical occupational hazard of being a designer. Maybe the steam from yesterday's shower had created a pattern. Maybe the ventilation fan had blown dust around in an unusual way. Maybe I'd traced it myself without thinking. You know how you sometimes draw shapes in foggy glass? Your finger moves almost unconsciously, creating patterns while your mind wanders. But the letters were too perfect, too deliberate. And I remembered my shower from the night before. Quick, efficient, barely enough steam to fog the mirror. Plus, I never wrote words in steam. Shapes, maybe. Hearts or smiley faces when I was feeling particularly silly. Never words. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, toothbrush frozen halfway to my mouth, studying those letters. The dust wasn't thick, just a light coating, the kind that accumulates on surfaces you don't clean daily. but it had been disturbed with surgical precision. Each letter was clean and sharp, the surrounding dust undisturbed. I wiped it away with my palm harder than necessary. The mirror squeaked against my skin, and I felt the grit of dust particles grinding between glass and flesh. Told myself I was being ridiculous. Went back to my routine, brush teeth, wash face, avoid eye contact with my reflection. Went back to work, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you're alone but you don't feel alone? Like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? That's how my apartment felt that Tuesday morning. The familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the vintage clock I'd bought at an estate sale, the distant Portland traffic, they all seemed muffled, distant, like I was hearing them through water. I threw myself into the bakery logo, sketching variations until my hand cramped. Wheat stalks and rolling pins and ovens with cheerful flames. Warm colors, gold and brown and cream. Everything opposite to the gray morning, and the cold certainty that something in my apartment had changed. Around noon, my stomach reminded me that coffee wasn't a food group. I padded to the kitchen in socked feet, avoiding the 3 creaky spots out of habit. The kitchen was my favorite room, exposed brick wall, vintage subway tiles I'd installed myself, black granite countertops that showed every speck of dust but looked sophisticated when clean. I'd wiped those counters down the night before. I was sure of it. I always cleaned the kitchen after dinner, a habit left over from my marriage. Mark used to tease me about it, calling me obsessive. But I liked starting each day with clean surfaces, clear space for clear thinking. That's when I saw the second word. On my black granite countertop, in a thin layer of dust I swear wasn't there an hour ago. Hello, 5 letters this time. Same perfect script, same impossible precision. And definitely absolutely not there when I'd made coffee that morning. My hands started shaking. Actually shaking, like I was cold or afraid or both. I dropped my coffee mug, the blue ceramic one my sister had made in pottery class, the one with the slightly lopsided handle that fit my fingers perfectly. Watched it shatter across the tile floor in slow motion, ceramic shards spreading like a constellation of destruction. The sound was so loud in the silence, too loud. It echoed off the brick wall and subway tiles, bouncing back at me from every surface until it felt like the apartment itself was screaming. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers, started to call. Who? The police? And say what? Help. There's dust in my house. They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. Maybe 3 years of solitude had finally caught up with me. Maybe grief and loneliness had finally broken something essential in my brain. But as I stood there, surrounded by broken ceramic and impossible words, another thought crept in. What if I wasn't crazy? What if something was actually happening here? I spent the next hour in a cleaning frenzy, wiped every surface with disinfectant that made my eyes water, vacuumed every corner, every crevice, every spot where dust might hide. The Dyson roared like an angry beast, sucking up evidence and explanations with equal efficiency. Opened all the windows to let the Portland rain smell clear my head and my apartment. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying hints of wet leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Normal smells, comforting smells, reality smells. I breathed deeply and told myself I'd been working too hard, seeing things, creating patterns where none existed because that's what my brain was trained to do. But as I cleaned, I noticed something else. The dust in my apartment, there was too much of it. I'm not a neat freak, but I'm not a slob either. I clean regularly, vacuum twice a week, dust the obvious surfaces every weekend. Yet, there was dust everywhere. In corners I'd just cleaned last week. On picture frames I'd just wiped down. Along the baseboards, I was certain I'd vacuumed 3 days ago. Where was it all coming from? Portland wasn't particularly dusty. My windows were usually closed. I didn't have pets, barely had visitors. The building was old, but well-maintained. Nothing that would explain this accumulation of fine particles that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. I found myself examining dust like it was evidence, running my finger along windowsills and studying the residue. Most of it was normal skin cells, fabric fibers, microscopic debris from daily life. But some of it was different, finer, more metallic, almost shimmery in the afternoon light. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator cycling on, the tick of the clock measuring out seconds. The soft whisper of what? Wind through the windows I'd sealed shut? The heating system I'd turned off? Or something else entirely? I found myself listening for the sound of movement. Footsteps that couldn't exist. Breathing that wasn't mine. The soft whisper of fingers drawing in dust. Wednesday morning came gray and drizzly. Typical Portland weather that matched my mood perfectly. I made my coffee stronger than usual, added an extra sugar for courage I didn't feel. Checked my emails with mechanical precision, responding to client queries and revision requests without really reading them. Tried to pretend everything was normal. Then I opened my laptop. The screen was covered in dust. Not unusual. Electronics are dust magnets, and I'd been too distracted yesterday to notice. But as I reached for a cleaning cloth, I saw the pattern. In the thin layer of dust that had somehow accumulated overnight. Sarah, my name. It knew my name. I slammed the laptop shut so hard the kitchen table shook. Stood up so fast my chair fell over with a crash that echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest, flee this impossible situation, find somewhere safe and logical and dust-free. That's when I heard it. Soft. So soft I almost missed it under the sound of my own panicked breathing. The sound of something moving across a surface like a finger drawing in dust. Deliberate, patient, creating patterns in the microscopic debris of daily life. I turned toward my living room window, the big one that overlooks the street, where I'd watched neighbors walk dogs and delivery trucks navigate potholes, where I'd seen seasons change through glass that suddenly felt transparent in all the wrong ways. And there, appearing letter by letter in the dust on the glass, like invisible hands were writing a message meant just for me. Don't be afraid. I ran, grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, my phone from the counter, didn't even put on shoes, just ran in socked feet down 3 flights of stairs and out into the drizzle, where the world still made sense, and dust was just dust and words didn't appear from nowhere. I spent the rest of the day at Powell's Books, surrounded by people and stories and blessed normalcy. Bought 3 novels I didn't need and drank overpriced coffee until my hands stopped shaking. Called my sister in Seattle and talked about nothing important until my voice sounded like it belonged to me again. But I had to go home eventually, and when I did, every surface in my apartment was covered in words. Not sentences, not paragraphs, just words, scattered across every dusty surface like a poem written by the universe itself. Random at first glance, but the more I looked, the more patterns I saw. Connections, meaning, purpose. Lonely appeared 17 times on different surfaces. I counted. Counted because counting made it feel manageable, made it feel like something I could quantify and therefore understand. Kitchen counter, bathroom mirror, laptop screen, picture frames, the surface of my coffee table. 17 instances of the same word, written in the same impossible script. Remember was written on every mirror in the apartment. All 3 of them. Bathroom, bedroom, the decorative one in the hallway. Same word, same handwriting. Same question mark hanging in the air. Remember what? Stay covered the kitchen cabinets like commandments. Upper cabinets, lower cabinets, even the lazy Susan that I rarely opened. Dozens of instances of the same plea, the same request, the same desperate hope that I wouldn't flee again. And on my bedroom door, in letters so large they took up the entire surface, dominating the white paint like a billboard designed just for me. Please? I stood in my apartment doorway for, I don't know how long, 5 minutes, an hour? Time felt strange, thick, like moving through honey or dreams or the space between moments. My key was still in my hand, door still open behind me, offering escape to a world where physics worked properly and dust behaved according to natural laws. Part of me wanted to run again, pack everything I could carry, and drive to my parents' house in Eugene. Sleep in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by participation trophies and high school yearbooks, where the biggest mystery was why I'd thought that hairstyle looked good in senior photos. But another part was curious. Whatever this was, it wasn't threatening me. The words weren't menacing or angry or cruel. They were communicating, reaching out in the only way they could, using the only medium available. I found myself speaking out loud, feeling slightly ridiculous, but needing to try. What do you want? Silence. The kind of silence that feels full rather than empty, pregnant with possibilities and explanations and words waiting to be born. Then, movement. In the dust on my coffee table, letters forming slowly, deliberately, like watching time-lapse photography of plants growing towards sunlight. To be seen. My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even to myself. I see you. New letters appeared on the same surface, written underneath the first message like a conversation taking shape. Not enough. What are you? I asked, and realized I was holding my breath. This time, the words appeared on my TV screen, letters forming in the dust that had accumulated on the black surface overnight. Forgotten. Over the next few days, I fell into the strangest routine of my life. Wake up. Find new messages scattered throughout the apartment like breadcrumbs leading towards understanding. Try to decode meaning from words that appeared on surfaces I'd cleaned hours before. Try to understand what it meant to be forgotten. The words were getting more complex, more personal, more impossible to explain away as coincidence or delusion or the side effects of too much isolation. You work too much appeared on my computer monitor one morning, right across the logo I'd been struggling with for 3 days. The client wanted something more dynamic, whatever that meant, and I'd been pushing pixels around the screen until they blurred together into meaningless shapes. Eat something healthy showed up on my refrigerator door, right next to the takeout menus I'd been cycling through for weeks. Thai food, pizza, Chinese, repeat. The kind of diet that sustained you without nourishing you, that filled your stomach without feeding your soul. Your mother misses you materialized on my phone screen one afternoon, appearing in the dust that had somehow accumulated on glass I'd cleaned that morning. Mom had called 3 times that week. I'd let all 3 calls go to voicemail, telling myself I'd call back later, tomorrow, when I felt more like myself. It was like having the world's strangest roommate. One made entirely of dust and good intentions, who noticed things I ignored and cared about details I'd stopped paying attention to. Someone who saw me clearly enough to offer advice I needed but didn't want to hear. I started talking to it, to them, to whatever was using my dust as a voice, my apartment as a canvas, my loneliness as an invitation. "Are you a ghost?" I asked one evening, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine and the kind of curiosity that felt both dangerous and necessary. Something like that appeared on my window, letters forming in the condensation from my breath on cold glass. "Did you live here before?" "Everywhere, nowhere." That's not really an answer, isn't it? The weird thing was, I was getting used to it, the constant messages, the sense of being watched not with malice but with interest, with care, with something that felt almost like affection. It was almost comforting. After 3 years of living alone, of quiet evenings and silent mornings, of conversations with no one but myself. I had company. I know how that sounds. Trust me. But loneliness does strange things to people. Makes you accept things you shouldn't. Makes you see companionship in impossible places. Makes you grateful for attention even when that attention comes from sources that defy explanation. The messages became a conversation. A slow, dusty dialogue between me and something that understood solitude in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. "Why me?" I asked one night, after finding "You're stronger than you think" written across my bathroom mirror. "You see patterns" appeared on my laptop screen, letters forming while I watched. "Is that all? You're kind." How do you know that? I watch, I listen, I know. That should have scared me more than it did. The idea that something had been observing me, cataloging my habits, learning my routines. But instead, it felt validating. Someone, something, had been paying attention. Had noticed the small kindnesses I thought went unseen. The way I left food for the stray cat in the alley. The way I always said thank you to delivery drivers. The way I held doors and picked up litter and smiled at strangers even when I felt invisible myself. Thursday evening, I was working on the bakery logo, finally making progress, finding the more dynamic energy my client wanted, when new words appeared on my second monitor. "You're talented." I actually smiled. First genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Thanks. Wasted here. I stared at those words for a long time, because they weren't wrong. Since the divorce, I'd barely left my apartment except for necessities, groceries, post office, doctor appointments. I turned down invitations to gallery openings, design conferences, coffee dates with other freelancers, built a little bubble of safety and called it a life. "It's easier this way," I said finally, words echoing in the quiet apartment. "Easier isn't better." Speaking from experience. Yes. That's when I asked the question I'd been avoiding. The one that would change everything, open doors I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. "What happened to you?" The apartment fell still. Even the ever-present Portland rain seemed to pause, holding its breath along with me. The silence stretched until it felt elastic, ready to snap under the weight of whatever truth was coming. Then, slowly, words began appearing on every surface. Not just one or two messages, dozens of them. The same word, over and over, covering walls and floors and ceilings like a prayer, repeated until it became a scream. Forgotten, 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 forgotten. The word covered my walls, my floors, my ceiling. Layered over itself in different sizes, different orientations, until the dust was thick enough to fall in small drifts. And in the center of it all, on my living room wall, larger letters spelled out the truth I should have guessed from the beginning. I died alone. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my computer, researching my apartment building with the kind of obsessive focus I usually reserved for particularly challenging design projects. The building was constructed in 1947, part of Portland's post-war housing boom. Originally single-family residences, converted to apartments in the 1980s when the neighborhood started attracting artists and young professionals who couldn't afford houses but wanted character and charm. Nothing unusual there. Standard Portland gentrification story, repeated in neighborhoods across the city. But as I dug deeper into old newspaper archives and property records, following digital breadcrumbs through decades of bureaucratic documentation, I found something. In 1962, a woman named Eleanor Marsh lived in what was now my unit. She was 43, unmarried, worked as a secretary at a downtown law firm. The kind of job that paid enough to live on but not enough to live well. Reliable, invisible, essential but unnoticed. And on November 15th, 1962, she simply vanished. Not dramatically, not mysteriously. She just stopped showing up to work, stopped answering her door, stopped participating in the small rituals of daily life that prove we exist. Her supervisor called after 3 days. The landlord checked after a week. Neighbors started to wonder after 2 weeks. But it wasn't until 6 weeks later, when the landlord finally used his key because the rent was overdue and complaints about the smell were mounting, that anyone found her. Natural causes, the report said. Heart failure. No signs of foul play, no evidence of suicide. Just a woman who died alone in an apartment that felt too much like mine, discovered only when her absence became an inconvenience for others. 6 weeks. She'd been gone 6 weeks before anyone found her. 6 weeks of being forgotten while the world continued spinning without her. I stared at her photograph in the old newspaper article. Black and white, grainy, but I could see kindness in her eyes. Intelligence. A certain wariness that spoke of disappointment and resilience in equal measure. She looked lonely, but also dignified. Like someone who had made peace with solitude even if she hadn't chosen it. Eleanor? I whispered to my empty apartment, the name feeling strange on my tongue. On my computer screen, slowly, carefully, like someone learning to write again after years of silence. Yes, you've been here all this time. Time is different now. Why show yourself to me? You understand. Understand what? Being unseen. I thought about all the days I'd spent alone in this apartment. Working, existing, not really living. How many days could I disappear before anyone noticed? My clients would email eventually, wonder where their revisions were. My mom would call after a week or two, leave increasingly worried voicemails. But would anyone actually come looking? Would anyone think to check? The parallel was uncomfortable. Eleanor and I, separated by decades but united by the particular loneliness of women who had learned to take up less space, who had mastered the art of being present without being noticed. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. I'm sorry you were alone. Not alone now. And that's when everything changed. The dust began to swirl. Not violently, not like a storm or a whirlwind. Gently, like snow in a snow globe, like dandelion seeds on a spring breeze. It gathered in the center of my living room, particles dancing and coalescing, taking shape. Not a human shape, nothing that defined. Just a presence. A form that suggested, rather than declared, that hinted at humanity without insisting on it. Translucent and shifting, held together by will and longing and the stubborn refusal to simply fade away. "This is you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The shape pulsed slightly, dust motes brightening and dimming like a slow heartbeat. "What's left?" "Does it hurt, being like this?" "No, just quiet." We stayed like that for hours, me on my couch, the dust form of Eleanor hovering nearby like a patient ghost, like a friend who had learned to wait. Not speaking, just being. Together in a way that felt both impossible and inevitable. It should have been terrifying. Every horror movie I'd ever seen said so. Ghosts were supposed to be frightening, malevolent, dangerous. But Eleanor wasn't any of those things. She was just present, grateful for acknowledgement, happy to be seen. It was the least alone I'd felt in years. Over the next week, Eleanor and I developed something resembling a normal routine. She'd leave messages each morning while I slept. Little encouragements or observations that greeted me like notes from a thoughtful roommate. Nice shirt might appear on my closet mirror when I'd chosen something brighter than my usual black and gray palette. Beautiful sunrise would materialize on my bedroom window when the Portland gloom lifted enough to let actual sunlight through. "Proud of you" showed up on my computer monitor the day I finally finished the bakery logo and sent it to the client. I'd talk to her while I worked, sharing thoughts I hadn't voiced in months, telling her about my projects, my frustrations with difficult clients, my fears about whether I was wasting my talent on corporate logos when I'd once dreamed of creating art that mattered. She'd respond in dust words, always patient, always kind, never judgmental. A conversation partner who listened without interrupting, who offered wisdom without lecturing. who understood the weight of solitude without trying to fix it. "Why dust?" I asked one day, watching particles swirl and settle on my coffee table. "It's everywhere. Forgotten but present, like me." That's actually kind of beautiful. Found poetry in physics. She had a sense of humor, Eleanor did. Dry as dust, pun absolutely intended. Clever in the way of people who had spent decades observing life rather than participating in it, who had learned to find amusement in small ironies and unexpected connections. We talked about everything. My work, her memories of Portland in the 1960s when the city was smaller and stranger. My divorce, her regrets about paths not taken, my fear of being forgotten, her experience of actually being forgotten. "What was it like?" I asked one evening, when it happened? Peaceful, unexpected, one moment there, next moment, different. Were you scared? Not of dying, of disappearing. What's the difference? Dying is natural. Disappearing is erasure. I thought about that for a long time. The difference between ending and being forgotten, between death as transition and death as negation. Eleanor hadn't just died. She'd been erased from the world so completely that decades passed before anyone wondered about her story. Is that why you stayed? Why you didn't move on? Didn't know how? Didn't have reason to? And now I have friend. But as the days passed, I noticed changes. The messages were getting fainter, taking longer to form. The dust shape that was Eleanor seemed thinner, less substantial. Sometimes, when she tried to communicate, only fragments of letters would appear, incomplete words that dissolved before I could read them. "What's happening?" I asked one evening, watching her struggle to form a simple hello on my kitchen counter. "Using too much energy. To communicate with me? Worth it. Eleanor, no. If this is hurting you. Not hurt, just fading. Don't go." The words came out before I could stop them, raw and desperate. "Please, I need you." "No, you don't." "I do. I've been so alone." Were, not are. She was right. In the past 2 weeks, I'd started answering texts from friends I'd been ignoring for months. Made plans for coffee with another freelancer. Even called my mom back. Had an actual conversation instead of letting it go to voicemail. Somehow, being seen by Eleanor had reminded me how to be seen by others. Her attention had made me visible to myself again, had reminded me that I existed beyond the confines of my apartment. And my solitude. "You did this on purpose," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Helped me. Helped each other. But what about you? You'll be alone again." "No." Moving on. "Where?" "Don't know. Not scared anymore." The dust began to settle, slowly, gently, like snow at the end of a storm, like the final notes of a song fading into silence. Eleanor's presence grew lighter, more translucent, until she was barely more than a suggestion of movement in the air. "Eleanor, wait!" One last message appeared on my window, not in dust this time. In the condensation from my breath on the glass, letters forming from the moisture of my own life. "Thank you for seeing me." And then nothing. Just normal dust. Silent and still and utterly ordinary. I cried that night. Sat on my couch and cried for a woman I'd never met, but somehow knew better than people I'd known for years. Cried for her lonely death and her patient afterlife. Cried for myself. And all the ways I'd been disappearing, day by day, choice by choice, until I was barely more substantial than dust myself. The next morning, my apartment felt different. Empty in a way it hadn't before Eleanor, but also cleaner, lighter. Like something heavy had finally been set down, a burden shared and therefore lessened. I threw myself into living, really living. Met friends for lunch instead of making excuses. Joined a hiking group that explored Portland's endless trails. Started dating again, cautiously but hopefully. Even adopted a cat from the shelter, a dusty gray tabby with knowing eyes that I named Ellie in honor of my ghostly friend. My apartment stayed remarkably dust-free after that. I mean, normal amounts of dust, sure. The inevitable accumulation of skin cells and fabric fibers and microscopic debris that comes with simply existing in the world. But nothing like before. Nothing that formed words or patterns or reminders of other possibilities. Or, so I thought. 3 months after Eleanor left, I was cleaning out my bedroom closet, finally tackling the boxes I'd shoved in there after the divorce and never opened. Most of it was junk, stuff I'd packed without thinking because sorting through a shared life was too overwhelming. But at the back, behind winter coats I never wore and shoes that didn't fit, I found something I didn't remember putting there. A small wooden box, old and worn, the kind secretaries might have used to store important papers in an era before digital files. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, a secretary's handbook from 1962, professional standards for modern office workers. The cover declared in earnest typography. Eleanor's name was written carefully on the inside cover in fountain pen ink, letters formed with the same precision I'd learned to recognize in dust. Under her name, in handwriting so faint I had to squint to read it, someone had added, "For Sarah, thank you for the conversation." I sat on my bedroom floor, holding that book, and laughed through my tears. Because of course, Eleanor would find a way to leave a proper goodbye. Of course, she would manage one last gift, one final proof that our friendship had been real. That was 6 months ago. I keep the handbook on my bookshelf now, next to a photo of me actually living my life. Hiking with friends, laughing at a gallery opening, holding Ellie at the adoption event. Proof that I'm here, that I'm seen, that I matter enough to be remembered. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the afternoon light hits just right and I'm feeling particularly contemplative, I'll see something in the dust on my bookshelf, never full words, just patterns that might be letters if you looked at them right. Might be. Still here? I'll whisper, half joking, half hopeful, and once, just once, I swear I saw a heart drawn in the dust on Eleanor's handbook. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was Ellie's paw prints. Maybe dust really can form patterns that look like communication if you want to see them badly enough. Or maybe some connections transcend the physical. Maybe kindness echoes longer than we think. Maybe being truly seen by someone changes you in ways that last forever, creates bonds that survive even death. I don't clean that bookshelf as often as I should, just in case. Because here's what I learned from Eleanor, what she taught me in her patient, dusty way. We're all just particles in the end. Temporary arrangements of matter in an infinite universe, destined to scatter and reform and scatter again. But for a brief moment, one precious, impossible moment, we can form patterns. We can create meaning. We can say, "I see you," and mean it. And that's not nothing. That's everything. The dust in our homes isn't just debris. It's memory made visible. Skin cells from people we've loved, fabric fibers from clothes that held our dreams, microscopic remnants of all the places we've been and all the things we've touched. It's the physical evidence of lives lived, of existence that mattered even when it felt invisible. Eleanor showed me that being forgotten isn't the same as never having mattered. Her life had value, her kindness had impact, her story deserved to be told even if no one was listening when she first tried to tell it. She had been someone, funny, intelligent, observant, caring, and death couldn't erase that truth even if life had tried to. She also showed me that I was disappearing long before I died. That isolation was its own kind of death, a slow erasure that happened one declined invitation at a time, one unanswered phone call at a time, one excuse at a time. I had been ghosting my own life, becoming transparent to the world and to myself. But here's the thing about patterns. They can be rearranged. Dust can settle differently. Words can be rewritten. Lives can be lived again, better this time, with more attention to the connections that make us real. So, I ask you again, when was the last time you really looked at the dust in your home? Really looked? Because sometimes the most important messages come from the places we forget to clean, from the people we forget to see, from the voices that speak in whispers we have to strain to hear. Sometimes they come from the dust itself, patient and persistent, waiting to be noticed, waiting to matter, waiting to be seen. And if you see words in your dust, don't be afraid, say hello. You might be surprised who answers back. You might discover that loneliness is more common than we think, that the forgotten outnumber the remembered, that someone, somewhere, is writing messages in the microscopic debris of daily life, hoping against hope that someone will notice. But remember, they won't stay forever. None of us do. Energy fades, patterns dissolve, even the most persistent ghost eventually finds peace. So while they're here, while you're here, make it count. See and be seen. Connect and be connected. Love and be loved. Before you're just dust too, before we're all forgotten. Like Eleanor almost was. Like I almost was. Like maybe you almost are. It's been a year now since Eleanor moved on, and my life has changed in ways I never expected. The apartment that once felt like a prison now feels like a home. I have friends who visit regularly, clients who've become collaborators, a relationship with David, the photographer from my hiking group, that's built on seeing each other clearly rather than hiding in comfortable shadows. But the most unexpected change came 3 months ago, when I finally worked up the courage to share Eleanor's story. I started small. A blog post on my design website filed under personal projects. I wasn't sure anyone would read it, wasn't sure I wanted them to, but something about Eleanor's story felt too important to keep to myself. She had been forgotten once. I couldn't let it happen again. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from people who had experienced similar things, not necessarily dust-writing words, but other impossible communications. Flickering lights that seemed to respond to questions. Objects that moved when no one was watching. Sounds that felt like whispers from somewhere else. Maria from Austin wrote about finding her grandmother's handwriting in steam on her shower door, years after her grandmother's death. The message was simple. Mija, eat more vegetables. But it came at a moment when Maria was struggling with an eating disorder, when she needed her grandmother's voice more than ever. James from Toronto described coins that appeared in impossible places, inside sealed jars, between pages of books he'd never opened, in the pockets of clothes he'd never worn. Always pennies from 1987, the year his brother died. Always in moments when James felt most alone. Sarah from London, another Sarah which felt like a sign, told me about a vintage radio that played songs from the 1940s, even though it wasn't plugged in. The songs were always ones her great-uncle had hummed while working in his garden, melodies she'd almost forgotten until they came drifting through static from somewhere beyond. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: loneliness, loss, the desperate human need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. And on the other side, love that persisted beyond death. Connections that refused to be severed by something as simple as stopping breathing. I started a forum, called it Dust and Echoes, a place for people to share their own experiences with impossible communications. It grew faster than I expected, attracting people from around the world who had stories they'd never told anyone, experiences they'd dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. But here's what I learned from their stories. None of us are as alone as we think. The world is full of messages waiting to be received, connections waiting to be made, love waiting to be acknowledged. We just have to be willing to look for it in unlikely places, to listen for it in frequencies we don't usually hear. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a physicist from UC Berkeley, joined the forum after reading about Eleanor. She's been studying what she calls quantum consciousness, the possibility that consciousness might persist in some form after death, that information might be encoded in ways we don't yet understand. What if, she wrote in one post, consciousness isn't just electrical impulses in the brain? What if it's something more fundamental, something that can interact with matter in ways we haven't discovered yet? Dust particles are incredibly small, incredibly light. They respond to electromagnetic fields, to air currents, to forces we can barely measure. What if consciousness, or the echo of consciousness, could influence those movements? I don't know if she's right. I don't know if there's a scientific explanation for what happened to me, or if some things are meant to remain mysterious. But I know what I experienced was real. I know Eleanor was real. I know the comfort she brought me, the changes she inspired, the love she shared all mattered. And I know I'm not the only one. The forum now has over 15,000 members. People from every continent, every walk of life, every belief system. Scientists and artists, skeptics and believers. People who've had their own impossible experiences and people who just want to understand. We've become a community of the formerly forgotten, the almost disappeared, the people who've learned to see messages in the margins of ordinary life. We remind each other that we matter, that our stories deserve to be told, that being seen is both a gift we can give and a gift we can receive. Last month, I organized the first Dust and Echoes meetup in Portland. 12 people showed up at Powell's Books, the same bookstore where I'd hidden the day I first met Eleanor. We sat in a circle and shared our stories, our experiences, our questions about what lies beyond the veil of ordinary reality. One woman, Gladys, brought a photo of her late husband. She'd been finding his initials traced in the dust on her car windshield every morning for 6 months. Not random scratches, perfect letters drawn with love and persistence. The car was garaged, the garage was locked, but still the letters appeared. I used to clean them off, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Thought it was disrespectful. Somehow, leaving them there, but then I realized he's trying to tell me he's still here, still watching over me. Who am I to erase that? A young man named Marcus shared his story about finding his mother's favorite song lyrics written in the dust on his piano. She'd died when he was 12, and he'd stopped playing music entirely after her death. The lyrics appeared every time he considered selling the piano, always from songs she'd sung to him as a child. I started playing again, he said, eyes bright with tears. Started writing my own songs. I think she wanted me to remember that music was how we connected, how we still connect. Story after story, experience after experience. Each one different, each one impossible, each one absolutely real to the person who lived it. We're planning more meetups now, creating a network of people who understand that the boundary between life and death might be more porous than we think, that love might be more persistent than we imagine, that the forgotten might find ways to be remembered if we're willing to pay attention. I've been thinking a lot about dust lately, not just the dust in my apartment, but dust in general, the way it accumulates, the way it moves, the way it carries traces of everything it touches. Did you know that household dust travels around the world? Particles that start in the Sahara Desert end up in Amazon rainforests. Dust from your hometown might be settling on surfaces in Tokyo right now, carrying microscopic pieces of your life to places you'll never see. We're all connected by dust, literally. The skin cells I shed today might become part of the dust in your home tomorrow. The fabric fibers from your favorite shirt might settle on a surface in someone else's apartment next week. We're constantly exchanging particles, constantly sharing pieces of ourselves with strangers we'll never meet. There's something beautiful about that, something hopeful. It means we're all part of the same vast interconnected system. We're all leaving traces, all contributing to the great mixing bowl of existence. But it also means we're all responsible for each other in ways we don't usually consider. The dust in your home might contain pieces of people who lived and loved and mattered. The particles you brush away might be carrying messages from someone who just wants to be remembered. That's why I keep Eleanor's handbook on my dusty shelf. That's why I don't clean it as often as I should, because I want to honor the possibility that she's still there, still watching, still finding ways to say hello. Because I want to remember that everyone deserves to be seen, to be remembered, to matter, even after they're gone. Especially after they're gone. The dust in my house doesn't form words on surfaces anymore. Not usually. But sometimes, when the light hits just right, I'll see patterns that might be letters, might be messages, might be reminders that love persists in ways we don't always understand. And I'll whisper, "Hello, Eleanor," to the empty air, because even if she's not there, even if it's just dust being dust, the act of remembering matters. The act of seeing matters. The act of acknowledging that someone existed, that someone cared, that someone left traces of themselves in the world. That matters too. Look closer at your dust tonight, really look. And if you see something impossible, something that shouldn't be there but is, maybe leave a comment on the forum. Tell us what words you find. Tell us what messages appear when you least expect them. Because I don't think Eleanor was the only one. I think they're everywhere. The forgotten ones, writing messages in dust and hoping someone will notice. Writing love letters in languages we're only beginning to learn. Writing proof that they existed, that they mattered. That death isn't the end of caring. I think they're in your house right now. Watching, waiting, writing. And all they want, all any of us want, is someone to see the words we leave behind. Someone to read the messages we write in the dust of ordinary days. Someone to remember that we were here, that we mattered, that we loved, that we were seen, even if only for a moment. Even if only by dust. Even if only by someone who understands that the smallest traces can carry the largest truths. Look for the patterns. Listen for the whispers. See what wants to be seen. And remember, we're all just dust in the end. But what beautiful, meaningful, love-filled dust we can be. If you have your own Dust and Echoes story, please share it at dustandechoes.com. Eleanor's handbook is on display there, along with hundreds of other impossible communications that remind us we're never truly alone. Remember, see and be seen. Love and be loved, matter and be remembered, the dust is listening. Story number 2. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might save your life. Or, at the very least, it'll make you check every corner of your room before you sleep tonight. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a cartographer from Portland, Oregon. I make maps for a living, but last month I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about navigation and nature itself. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe turn on a light, just to be safe. And now, the story begins. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were always my work-from-home days, and I was still in my pajamas when the doorbell rang. The delivery guy left it on my porch, a small brown box with no return address, just my name written in spidery handwriting. Inside was a mason jar, and inside that jar was the most beautiful spider I'd ever seen. Now, I'm not usually a spider person. Growing up in suburban Seattle, I'd scream whenever I found one in my bedroom. But this one was different. Its body was about the size of a quarter, deep burgundy with intricate gold patterns that seemed to shimmer when it moved. 8 delicate legs, each one marked with tiny geometric designs that looked almost like coordinates. There was a note tucked under the jar. For the mapmaker who sees what others miss, handle with care, she shows the way. No signature, nothing else. I should have thrown it away, should have called animal control, or I don't know, posted about it on Reddit to see if anyone knew what species it was. But something about those patterns on its body, they weren't random. As someone who'd spent 15 years studying maps and geographical patterns, I could tell. Those markings meant something. I named her Compass. Silly, I know, but it felt right. That first night, I set up a small terrarium in my home office. Just a simple glass box with some twigs and leaves from my backyard. I figured I'd keep her for a day or two, maybe take some photos to identify the species, then release her somewhere safe. But when I woke up the next morning, Compass had been busy. Where a normal spider would have woven a web, she had created something else entirely. Delicate silk threads stretched across the terrarium, but not in the circular or funnel patterns you'd expect. The threads formed lines, intersections, a grid. It was a map. I grabbed my magnifying glass, my hands shaking slightly. The silk threads showed my neighborhood. Not perfectly to scale, but unmistakable. There was the curve of Hawthorne Boulevard, the intersection where the food carts gathered, even the little dead-end street where my house sat, all rendered in spider silk. That's not possible, I whispered to myself. But there it was. Compass sat in the corner of her terrarium, perfectly still, watching me with those 8 tiny eyes. I spent the entire day observing her. She didn't move much during daylight hours, just occasional small adjustments to her position. But as evening approached, she began to work again, methodically, purposefully, adding new threads to her silk map. By Thursday morning, the map had expanded. It now showed a wider area of Portland, neighborhoods I recognized, streets I'd driven down hundreds of times. But there was something else, a small cluster of red silk in the corner of the map. It pulsed slightly in the morning light, drawing my eye. I cross-referenced it with Google Maps on my laptop. The red silk marked an area in Forest Park, a section of trails I'd hiked maybe once or twice. Nothing special about it that I could remember. But Compass had marked it for a reason. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just ignore it? Why didn't I recognize this as the beginning of something I shouldn't pursue? But you have to understand, I make maps for a living. I've always been fascinated by how we navigate space, how we find our way. And here was a spider, a tiny arachnid, creating accurate geographical representations. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was irresistible. That afternoon I drove to Forest Park. The October air was crisp, leaves crunching under my hiking boots as I made my way to the area Compass had marked. It took me about 40 minutes of walking, following the lower Maclade Trail before veering off onto a smaller path. And then I saw them. More spiders. Dozens of them, all the same species as Compass, with those distinctive burgundy bodies and golden patterns. They had built their silk maps between the trees, massive installations that caught the filtered sunlight. But these weren't maps of Portland. I stood there, mouth open, trying to process what I was seeing. One map showed what looked like the Oregon coast, but with features I didn't recognize. Extra islands, different shaped bays. Another showed mountain ranges that didn't match any geography I knew. Beautiful, aren't they? I jumped, spinning around. A woman stood behind me on the trail. Middle-aged, wearing expensive hiking gear, with silver hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She smiled, but something about it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Dr. Elena Carver," she said, extending a hand. "I've been studying them for years. I wasn't expecting to find another enthusiast so soon." "I'm Sarah," I managed. Someone sent me one, in a jar." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. Usually people have to find them on their own. You must have caught someone's attention." She moved closer to one of the silk maps, careful not to disturb it. "Tell me, Sarah, what do you see when you look at these?" I studied the nearest map more carefully. The silk threads were impossibly fine, creating topographical details that should have been beyond any spider's ability. They're maps, but not of places I recognize. "Oh, but they are real places," Dr. Carver said softly, "just not places that exist. Yet." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me fully. "How much do you know about quantum mechanics, Sarah, about the many worlds theory?" "I'm a cartographer, not a physicist." "Fair enough. Let me put it simply. These spiders, we call them navigators. They don't just map our world. They map all possible worlds. Every choice, every quantum split, every variation of reality, they can see it all. And they weave it into silk." I wanted to laugh. It sounded insane, but I thought about Compass, sitting in her terrarium, creating a perfect map of my neighborhood without ever having seen it from above. "The one you have," Dr. Carver continued, "she's young. Probably only showing you familiar territories for now. But as she matures, she'll start showing you other possibilities. Other versions of the world that could have been, or might still be. That's..." I paused, trying to find the right word. "That's impossible." "Is it?" She gestured to the silk maps around us. "You're looking at the proof. These spiders have existed for millennia, Sarah. Hidden. Protected by those who understood their significance. Indigenous peoples knew about them. Early explorers sometimes stumbled upon their colonies and wrote about devil's silk that showed false lands. But we've kept them secret in modern times. We, the Cartographers Society, we're collectors, you might say. Protectors. We study the navigators and what they show us." She pulled out a business card. "My number. When your spider starts showing you things you don't understand, call me." She walked away before I could ask more questions, disappearing down the trail with surprising speed for someone her age. I stood there for another hour, studying the silk maps. Some showed variations so subtle I could barely spot them. A river that curved differently, a city that sprawled in another direction. Others were radically different. Land masses in wrong places, oceans where there should be deserts. When I finally got home that evening, Compass had added to her map. The red silk marker was gone, replaced by a new one. This time marking my house. My exact house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those silk maps in the forest. Impossible geographies woven by impossible creatures. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went to my office. Compass was active, adding new threads to her map. I watched her work, mesmerized by the precision of her movements. Each strand of silk placed with purpose, creating intersections and pathways that perfectly matched the Portland I knew. Except, wait, I leaned closer, adjusting my desk lamp. There was a street on her map that didn't exist, running parallel to Division, a major thoroughfare that had never been there. I checked Google Maps, nothing. Checked historical maps of Portland going back to the 1800s, still nothing. But on Compass's silk map, it was as real as any other street. "What are you showing me?" I whispered. As if in response, she began weaving faster. New threads appeared, creating buildings along the phantom street. Tiny silk dots that might represent trees. The detail was extraordinary. And completely fictional, or was it? Dr. Carver's words echoed in my mind. Other versions of the world that could have been. I must have dozed off at my desk, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the window and my phone buzzing. 3 missed calls from my mom, 2 from my boss. It was nearly noon. "Sarah, where have you been?" My boss, Marcus, sounded more worried than angry. "You missed the Davidson project meeting." "I'm sorry, I'm not feeling well. Think I'm coming down with something." "Take the day, but I need those watershed maps by Monday, okay?" I promised him I'd have them done and hung up, but I couldn't focus on work. not with compass continuing to add to her impossible map. By evening, the phantom street was complete, with detailed buildings and what looked like a small park at one end. That's when I made my first mistake. I decided to go look for it. I know, but wouldn't you? If something showed you a street that didn't exist, wouldn't you at least go check? Just to prove to yourself that it wasn't there? I drove to Division Street as the sun was setting, parking near where the phantom street should have been according to Compass's map. There was nothing there but a normal city block. A coffee shop, a vintage clothing store, a Thai restaurant I'd eaten at dozens of times. I walked along the sidewalk feeling slightly foolish. What had I expected? A secret street to suddenly materialize? But then I noticed something. A narrow alley between two buildings. I'd passed this spot hundreds of times and never paid attention to it. Just another service alley, full of dumpsters and delivery entrances. Except the angle was wrong. The alley was too wide, and it seemed to extend further back than it should. I stepped into the alley. The sounds of traffic faded surprisingly quickly. The walls on either side were old brick, covered in graffiti I didn't remember seeing before. And the alley kept going, much further than the depth of the buildings should have allowed. My heart was pounding now. This was stupid. I should turn back. But I kept walking, and then I emerged onto a street that shouldn't exist. It was exactly as Compass had mapped it. A quiet residential street, lined with Victorian houses that looked both perfectly maintained and subtly wrong. The architectural details were off. Windows in strange places, doors that seemed too tall or too narrow. The street lamps were an old-fashioned design, but they gave off a light that was too white, too harsh. There were people here, walking their dogs, sitting on porches, normal evening activities, but none of them looked at me. Not once. Even when I walked right past them, they kept their eyes averted, as if I wasn't there, or as if they were trying very hard to pretend I wasn't there. I made it halfway down the block before my nerve broke. The wrongness of it all. The silence despite the visible activity, the way shadows fell at incorrect angles. The smell in the air like ozone before a storm. It was too much. I turned and ran, sprinted back through the alley, which seemed even longer on the return journey. When I finally burst out onto Division Street, gasping for breath, the normal sounds of Portland traffic were the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. A couple walking by gave me odd looks, and I realized how I must appear. Wild-eyed, panting, emerging from what they probably saw as just another mundane alley. Because when I turned to look back, that's all it was. A narrow space between buildings, barely wide enough for a dumpster. I could see straight through to the loading dock on the other side. The impossible street was gone. When I got home, hands still shaking, Compass had added more to her map. The phantom street now showed tiny figures, silk dots moving along the threads, and at the center of the street, a building marked in red silk. A building I hadn't reached during my terrified exploration. I picked up Dr. Carver's business card, hesitating. Calling her would mean admitting this was real, that I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing, that there really were streets in Portland that existed in some places but not others. But I needed answers. She picked up on the second ring. "Sarah, I was wondering when you'd call." "I saw it," I said without preamble. "The street that shouldn't exist. I walked down it." A pause. "You went alone? That was unwise. The threshold areas can be unstable. You're lucky you found your way back." "Threshold areas?" "Places where different versions of reality touch. The navigators can see them all, map them all, but we can only access them under certain conditions, and without proper preparation it's easy to get lost between worlds." "This is insane." "Yes," she agreed simply, "but that doesn't make it less real. Tell me, is your navigator showing you anything else? Any other marked locations?" I looked at Compass's terrarium. The red silk building pulsed gently in the lamplight. Yes, a building on that street. "Do not go back there alone," Dr. Carver said sharply. "Some variations are benign, just slightly different versions of our world. But others, Sarah, the navigators don't distinguish between safe and dangerous. They map everything, including the versions of reality we should never visit." "Why?" I asked. "Why do they make these maps?" "We don't know. Maybe it's instinct. Maybe they're trying to tell us something. Or maybe," she paused, "maybe they're not making maps for us at all." That thought chilled me more than anything else she'd said. After I hung up, I sat watching Compass work. She was adding more detail to other parts of Portland now, but my eyes kept being drawn back to that phantom street, to the red building at its heart. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd be smart, be careful, listen to Dr. Carver's warnings. But if you've ever had a puzzle you couldn't solve, a question that wouldn't let you sleep, you'll understand why that promise didn't last. 3 days. That's how long I managed to stay away. 3 days of pretending to work on watershed maps while actually watching Compass expand her Silk City. 3 days of normal Portland life, coffee shops and food trucks and light rain. While knowing that underneath it all, beside it all, were other versions of my city. Streets that existed and didn't exist. Buildings that were there if you knew how to look. Dr. Carver called twice. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for whatever she wanted to tell me, whether it was warnings or invitations to join her society of secret mapmakers. I needed to understand this for myself first. On the third night, Compass did something new. I was half asleep on the couch, some Netflix show playing in the background, when I heard a strange sound from my office, like paper rustling but softer, wet. Compass had built a bridge. A silk bridge extending from her terrarium to my desk. Impossibly long strands that shouldn't have been able to support their own weight. And she was crossing it, moving with deliberate purpose toward the maps spread across my workspace. I should have been frightened, should have trapped her back in the terrarium. Instead, I watched, fascinated, as she reached my current project, a topographical map of the Columbia River Gorge. She began to weave directly onto the paper. Her silk adhered to the map, creating new features. A waterfall that didn't exist, a trail that branched off into impossible directions, and then coordinates. Actual numbers woven in silk. 45, 5 degree N, 122, 1 degree W. I grabbed my phone, plugging them into Google Earth. They led to a spot in the gorge I'd never been to, near Multnomah Falls, but deeper in the forest. Wilderness area. Compass returned to her terrarium via her silk bridge, settling into her usual corner. The additions to my map gleamed in the lamplight, impossibly precise for something created by a spider. "You're trying to show me something," I said. "Something specific." She didn't move, didn't need to. The message was clear in silk. I lasted until morning before giving in. Packed my hiking gear, filled my water bottles, grabbed my emergency supplies. If I was going to do this, I'd at least be smart about it. I even left a note on my kitchen table with the coordinates, just in case. Just in case what? I didn't want to think about that. The drive to the gorge took an hour. It was a beautiful October day. Clear skies, cool air, the trees showing off their fall colors. Normal hikers filled the popular trails, taking selfies at scenic viewpoints, enjoying the weekend. But I wasn't heading for the popular trails. Following my GPS, I left the main path after about 2 miles. The forest grew denser, quieter. The coordinates led me up a steep slope covered in moss and fallen logs. No trail here, just deer paths and my own determination. I smelled them before I saw them. That same ozone scent from the phantom street, but stronger, mixed with something organic, like wet earth and growing things. And then I crested a small ridge and found myself looking at another navigator colony. But this one was different from the Forest Park site. The webs here weren't just between trees. They covered everything. The ground, the rocks, even spanning across a small creek. Layer upon layer of silk maps, creating a three-dimensional atlas of impossible places. And the spiders, there must have been hundreds, all weaving, all adding to the massive construction. At the center was something that made me stop breathing, a structure made entirely of silk, as tall as a person, shaped like a door, a gateway. The silk here was different, thicker, more substantial. And through it, I could see, not the forest on the other side, something else. Somewhere else. A city that might have been Portland, but wasn't. Buildings in wrong places. Mount Hood visible, but shaped differently. And the sky was the wrong color. Too green, with clouds that moved in patterns that hurt to follow. Magnificent, isn't it? I spun around. Dr. Carver stood behind me, but she wasn't alone. 3 others were with her. 2 men and a woman, all wearing similar hiking gear, all watching me with careful eyes. "How did you—" "Your navigator," she said simply. "When one marks a new location, they all know. We've been waiting for you." She moved closer to the silk gateway, but carefully, respectfully. "This is a major confluence. A place where dozens of realities touch. The navigators have been building toward this for months." "Building toward what?" The woman beside Dr. Carver spoke up. Asian features, younger than the others, with an intensity that was almost frightening. "They're trying to go home." "Home?" "The navigators aren't from here," she continued. "Not from our version of reality. They're travelers, like their name suggests. Moving between worlds, mapping as they go. But something happened. They got stuck here, in our reality. And now they're trying to find their way back." I looked at the silk gateway again. Through it, that wrong version of Portland shifted and changed, like looking through water. "But why the maps?" I asked. "Why show us?" One of the men, older with a graying beard, answered, "We think they need us. Need someone from this reality to anchor them, to help them navigate. They can see all the possibilities, but they can't choose which one to follow. That requires consciousness, intent, will, and you want me to." "We don't want anything," Dr. Carver said firmly. "This is your choice, Sarah. The navigator chose you, marked you as compatible. You can walk away. Go back to your normal life, your normal maps. We'll take Compass and find her a home with the colony. Or," I prompted, "or you help them, step through the gateway, anchor them as they search for their home, guide them through the infinite possibilities of existence." "That's insane. I could get lost. I could die. I could—" "Yes," Dr. Carver agreed. "All of that and worse. Or you could see wonders beyond imagination. Map territories no human has ever conceived of. Become an explorer of realities." I thought about my life, my safe job making predictable maps of known places, my small house, my ordinary existence in one single version of Portland. And then I thought about that phantom street, about walking between worlds, about the infinite possibilities Compass had shown me. "What happened to the others?" I asked. "The other people the navigators chose?" The group exchanged glances. It was the younger woman who answered. "Some came back changed, enhanced, able to see the threshold places without the spider's help. Others," she shrugged, "others found homes in different realities, and a few never came back at all," Dr. Carver finished. "This isn't without risk, Sarah, but nothing worthwhile ever is." I stood at the edge of decision. Through the silk gateway that other Portland beckoned. I could see people there, or things that looked like people, going about their lives in a world just different enough to be terrifying. And then I saw her. Compass. She'd followed me somehow, was climbing the silk structure beside the gateway, waiting. "If I do this," I said slowly, "how do I get back?" "The same way you got back from the Phantom Street," Dr. Carver said. "By remembering who you are, where you come from, by holding tight to your own reality even as you walk through others. The navigators will help. They want to keep you safe. You're their guide, after all." I took a deep breath, then another, and then I stepped toward the gateway. The transition was gentler than I expected, like walking through cool mist. One moment I was in the familiar forest of the Columbia Gorge, the next I stood on a street in the wrong Portland. The air tasted different here, metallic. The gravity felt heavier, each step requiring more effort. Compass rode on my shoulder, her tiny legs gripping my jacket. Behind me, the gateway remained visible, a shimmer in the air that hurt to look at directly. My way home, I hoped. This Portland was empty. That was the first thing I noticed. Buildings stood intact, cars parked normally along the streets, but no people, no birds, no movement except the wind, which blew in patterns that made no meteorological sense. "Where is everyone?" I whispered. In response, compass began to weave, right there on my shoulder, creating a tiny map in silk. It showed my location, and dozens of red dots converging on it. The navigators. They were coming. They emerged from everywhere, storm drains, building cracks, spaces between reality I couldn't even see, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All burgundy and gold, all moving with purpose. They flowed across the empty streets like a living map, their bodies creating patterns and pathways. And then they began to build. Not maps this time. Something else. They connected to each other with silk, creating a vast web that centered on me. I felt it then. A pull. Not physical, but something deeper. They were using me as an anchor, just as Dr. Carver had said. Through me, they could feel their way home. The world shifted. One moment, empty Portland. The next, a city flooded with impossible water. Buildings rising from an ocean that shouldn't exist. Then a Portland made of glass, every surface reflecting different realities. Then one where the trees had taken over, massive roots cracking through streets, branches forming tunnels of green. Each shift pulled at something inside me. I gripped my own memories. The smell of coffee from my favorite shop, the sound of rain on my roof, the feeling of normal earth beneath my feet. I was the anchor. I had to hold steady. Compass chittered in my ear. The first sound I'd ever heard her make, urgent. Directing, I began to walk. The navigators moved with me, their silk network adjusting with each step. They were searching through the realities, using my movement to steer, looking for something specific, their home. We passed through dozens of versions of Portland, some beautiful, some terrifying. A city where the buildings sang, one where the sky had shattered like glass, showing stars in impossible colors. Another where everyone walked backward, their faces turned away from where they were going. With each transition, I felt myself spreading thinner. It was hard to remember which memories were real. Had I always lived in Portland? Was my name really Sarah? Did maps exist in my world, or was that something I dreamed? Focus, I told myself, gripping the straps of my backpack, real, solid, mine. And then we found it. I knew the moment we arrived. The navigators' excitement was palpable, their bodies practically vibrating. This wasn't Portland at all. It was somewhere else, everywhere else. A reality of pure connection. The landscape was made of webs. Not silk, but something more fundamental. Lines of force and possibility stretching in every direction, connecting every point to every other point. And moving along these lines were creatures like the navigators, but more. Evolved, beautiful. They danced between dimensions like dolphins through water. Home, I breathed, understanding flooding through me. This was where they belonged. A reality of pure navigation, where every path was open, every connection visible. But they couldn't stay without me. That was the terrible truth. They needed my anchor to remain here, to not get pulled back to my reality. And if I stayed... Compass moved from my shoulder to my hand. She looked up at me with those 8 tiny eyes, and I swear I saw gratitude there. Understanding and a question. I can't, I whispered. I'm sorry, but I can't stay here. I have a life, a world. I'm not meant for this place. She chittered again, not upset, just acknowledging. And then she began to weave one final map. This one was different. Instead of silk, she used something that looked like light. The map showed a path, not through space, but through possibilities. A way for the navigators to return home that didn't require a human anchor. A permanent connection between realities that they could traverse at will. But it would require a sacrifice. One navigator would have to stay behind, in my world, to maintain the bridge from the other side. Before I could object, Compass began the work. The other navigators contributed silk, power, essence. I don't have words for what I saw. They were building something into her, changing her, making her into a living gateway. No, I said, but it was already happening. Compass was growing, changing, becoming something more than just a spider, becoming a bridge between worlds. When it was done, she was no longer the tiny creature I'd kept in a terrarium. She was beautiful, terrifying. A spider the size of my hand, with patterns on her body that showed every reality at once. Looking at her was like looking at infinity. The other navigators began to cross, one by one, then in groups, then in waves. Passing through Compass into their home reality, each transition sent ripples through the dimensions, and I saw glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities. Finally, only Compass and I remained. She looked at me one last time, and I understood. She would live between worlds now. Part of both, fully of neither, the eternal mapmaker showing the way for any who might need it. Thank you, I said, not sure if she could understand. She raised one leg, pointing. Back the way we'd come. Home. The journey back was blurry. Reality after reality, but faster now. I wasn't searching, just returning. Following my own thread back to where I belonged. The empty Portland, the glass city, the flooded world. And finally, I stumbled out of the silk gateway into the familiar forest of the Columbia Gorge. Late afternoon sun slanted through the trees. Real trees. My trees. Dr. Carver was waiting, along with her colleagues. They looked relieved. How long? I asked, my voice hoarse. 6 hours, she said. You've been gone 6 hours. It felt like years, like minutes, like time didn't mean what I thought it meant. The navigators. Gone, the younger woman confirmed, looking at some kind of device. The dimensional readings show they've returned to their point of origin, all except... Compass stayed behind, I finished. She's the bridge now, the permanent connection. Dr. Carver studied me carefully. You've seen things, experienced things. You know you can't go back to normal life now. She was right. How could I make simple maps after walking between worlds? How could I pretend I didn't know about the infinite possibilities that existed just beside our own reality? So, what happens now? I asked. Now, she said with a small smile. You join us, the Cartographers Society. We have so much to show you, so much to learn. And Compass, she'll need someone who understands her, someone to help her with her work. I thought about my old life. Safe, predictable, one single reality. Where do I sign up? That was 3 months ago. I still live in Portland. I still make maps. But they're different now. I map the threshold places. The spots where reality wears thin. The streets that sometimes exist. The buildings that are there on Tuesdays but not Wednesdays. The parks where you can sometimes see through to other worlds. And compass, she has her own room in my house now. A whole room where she builds her bridges, maintains the connection between realities. Sometimes other navigators visit, brief glimpses of impossible spiders passing through to explore our world before returning home. Dr. Carver says I have a gift, that walking between worlds changed me, made me sensitive to the places where realities touch. I can see them now without compass's help, feel them, map them. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I've started to notice people, ordinary people living ordinary lives, but wrong. Like those people on the phantom street who wouldn't look at me. They're everywhere once you know how to see them. Versions of people from other realities who've somehow slipped through, lost between worlds. And their numbers are growing. Compass knows something. I can tell by the way she weaves, the patterns she creates. Something's happening. Something big. The barriers between realities aren't just thin anymore, they're breaking. But that's a story for another time. For now, I need you to do something for me. Look around your room, your house, your street. Really look. Because if you see a spider with burgundy and gold markings, if you see silk that looks like a map, if you notice a door or an alley that wasn't there yesterday, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't step through alone. The spiders are watching. They're always watching. And they're waiting for someone else who can see. Someone like you. Sleep tight. Story number 3. The mug shattered against my kitchen floor at 7:13 a.m., and that's when I knew something was wrong. Not because I dropped it, not because my hands were shaking, but because the coffee was still steaming hot. Even as it spread across the cold tiles, wisps of vapor rose from the puddle like tiny ghosts reaching for something I couldn't see. I'd been timing it for 3 weeks straight, every single morning. Same routine, same result. My coffee stayed hot for exactly 13 minutes. Not 12, not 14, 13 on the dot. If you're listening to this right now, probably tucked under your covers, thinking this is just another spooky story to help you drift off to sleep, I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow morning, when you make your coffee, time it. See how long yours stays hot. And if it's 13 minutes, God help you. You need to listen to every word I'm about to say. Because what I discovered changed everything. And if you're experiencing what I experienced, you're already running out of time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started. Let me tell you about the morning that ruined coffee for me forever. The story begins now. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've lived in Portland, Oregon for the past 5 years. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, which means coffee isn't just a beverage for me. It's a lifeline, a ritual, the thing that transforms me from a barely functioning zombie into someone who can actually string together coherent thoughts. 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning, I was working on a particularly demanding project for a tech startup downtown. The kind of project where they want you to somehow capture innovation and disruption in a logo that also needs to look timeless and classic. You know, the impossible ones. I'd made my usual cup of coffee at 6:47 a.m. Dark roast from that little place on Hawthorne. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, nothing fancy. I set it on my desk next to my computer and got lost in my work. When I finally remembered to take a sip, it was cold. Now, cold coffee happens to everyone. Nothing unusual there. But what caught my attention was the time. 7:01 a.m. I'd let my coffee sit for exactly 14 minutes. The next morning, I decided to pay attention. Made my coffee at 6:45 a.m. Took my first sip immediately. Perfect temperature. Checked again at 6:50, still hot. 6:55, still hot. 6:58, still hot. And then, at exactly 6:58, something strange happened. I watched the steam stop. Not gradually, not slowly. It just stopped. Like someone had flipped a switch. The surface of the coffee, which had been gently steaming, suddenly went still. When I touched the mug, it was room temperature. Maybe even a little cold. 13 minutes, exactly. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ceramic mugs. Heat transfer, basic physics. That's what I thought too. So I experimented. Different mugs, different types of coffee, different brewing methods, French press, pour over, even instant coffee, though that hurt my Portland soul a little. The result was always the same. 13 minutes of heat, then nothing. I started timing everything, recording it in a notebook. 6:45 a.m., coffee made. 6:58 a.m., coffee cold. 7:15 a.m., coffee made. 7:28 a.m., coffee cold. The pattern never changed. By the end of the first week, I'd filled 20 pages with timestamps. My friends thought I was losing it. Sarah, my best friend Megan, said over lunch at our usual spot in the Pearl District, "You're obsessing over nothing. Maybe your apartment is just drafty?" But it wasn't nothing. And it wasn't drafty, because on day 8 I discovered something that made my blood run colder than my 13-minute-old coffee. I wasn't the only one. It started with a Reddit post. Late one night, unable to sleep, again. I was scrolling through glitchin' the Matrix. You know, that subreddit where people share their weird experiences that don't quite make sense. Matrix glitches, Mandela effects, that sort of thing. The post was buried deep, maybe 3 months old. Only 2 upvotes, the title, "Anyone else notice their coffee cooling at exactly the same time every day?" My heart stopped. The user, Coffee Timer 503, described exactly what I'd been experiencing. Coffee staying hot for precisely 13 minutes, no matter what. They were from Seattle, just 3 hours north of me. They'd noticed it starting about 4 months ago, and then nothing. The account had been deleted. No follow-up posts, no comments, just gone. I spent the next 3 hours digging, found 2 more posts, one from a user in Tacoma, another from someone in Olympia, all Pacific Northwest, all describing the same phenomenon. All accounts deleted within days of posting. That's when I noticed the pattern. Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia. If you drew lines between them on a map, they formed an almost perfect square. And right in the center of that square, Mount St. Helens. Now, I'm not saying the mountain has anything to do with this, that would be crazy, but I am saying that everyone who'd posted about the 13-minute coffee thing lived within a very specific geographical area, and they'd all disappeared from the internet shortly after mentioning it. I should have stopped there, should have just accepted that sometimes coffee gets cold in weird ways and moved on with my life. But I didn't, because the next morning, something new happened. The morning after I found those Reddit posts, I made my coffee as usual. Set my timer, waited, but this time I watched the clock like my life depended on it. 6:45, 6:46, 6:47, at exactly 6:51, 6 minutes in. I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it, like someone breathing directly into my ear, except there was no one there. Just me, alone in my apartment, staring at a cup of coffee that would be cold in exactly 7 more minutes. The whisper came again at 6:54, 3 minutes later, louder this time. Still couldn't make out words, but there was definitely a voice. Maybe voices. Plural. At 6:57, with 1 minute left, the whispers became clear. Found another one. The coffee went cold at 6:58, right on schedule. But this time, I noticed something else. The reflection in the coffee's surface. It wasn't showing my kitchen ceiling like it should have. It was showing something else. Something that looked like, no, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Because before I could fully process what I was seeing, my doorbell rang. At 7 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, someone was at my door. I wasn't going to answer it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay quiet, to pretend I wasn't home. But then I heard her voice through the door. "Sarah? Sarah Chen? My name is Dr. Elizabeth Park. I'm here about your coffee." How did she know my name? How did she know about the coffee? I crept to the peephole and looked out. A woman in her 50s stood in my hallway, Asian features, graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a rain jacket, even though it wasn't raining. In her hand, she held a thermos. "I know this is strange," she continued, still speaking to my closed door. "But we need to talk. You've been timing it, haven't you? 13 minutes? My hand moved to the deadbolt before I could stop myself. Some part of me needed to know, needed answers. I opened the door just enough to see her fully. She looked tired. No, exhausted. Like she hadn't slept in weeks. "How do you know about that?" I asked. She held up the thermos. "Because mine does it too, has for the past 2 years. May I come in?" Against every horror movie rule I'd ever learned, I let her in. Dr. Park sat at my kitchen table, setting her thermos down carefully. She unscrewed the lid and steam rose from the opening. Fresh coffee. I glanced at my microwave clock. 7:03 a.m. "In exactly 10 minutes, she said, following my gaze. "This coffee will be ice cold, just like yours, just like everyone else's who's been marked." Marked? The word stuck in my throat. She nodded slowly. "That's what we call it. Those of us who know, there are maybe 30 of us in the Pacific Northwest, all experiencing the same thing, all trying to understand why." "The Reddit posts," I started. "Were mine," she admitted. "Different accounts. I was trying to find others. To see how far this had spread, I delete them after a few days for safety reasons." "Safety from what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a notebook similar to mine, filled with times, dates, but also other things, drawings, symbols I didn't recognize, maps with red X marks scattered across Washington and Oregon. "Tell me," she said, not looking up from her notebook, "have you heard them yet? The whispers?" My blood turned to ice. This morning, for the first time, her head snapped up. Fear flashed across her face. What did they say? Found another one. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Park's hands trembled as she closed her notebook. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then we're running out of time. They know about you now." "Who's they?" She glanced at her thermos. The steam was getting thinner. "I've been studying this for 2 years, the 13 minutes, the geographical pattern, the whispers. I'm a physicist. Or I was, before this consumed my life. And I think the coffee isn't the point, it's just a marker. A way for them to identify us. Identify us for what? People who can perceive the overlap." Before I could ask what she meant, she grabbed my hand. Her skin was ice cold. "Look at the coffee, your cold coffee. Look at the reflection." I pulled my mug closer. The coffee from earlier was still there, cold and forgotten. I looked down at the dark surface and nearly screamed. The reflection showed my kitchen, yes, but there were things in it that weren't really there. Shadows moving across the walls. Figures standing behind my chair. And in the center of it all, where I should have been reflected, something else looked back at me. Dr. Park's thermos clicked over to 13 minutes. The steam vanished instantly, and in that moment, every piece of glass in my apartment, every window, every picture frame, every reflective surface showed the same thing. We weren't alone. We had never been alone. And now that I could see them, they could see me too. "Don't look at them directly," Dr. Park warned. But it was too late. I was already staring at the things in the reflections. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Like someone had tried to draw people from memory but kept getting the proportions off. Too tall, arms too long. Faces that seemed to shift and change every time I blinked. But the worst part wasn't how they looked. It was how familiar they felt. Like seeing a friend from childhood whose name you can't quite remember. That nagging sensation that you should know them, that you do know them. But the memory keeps slipping away like steam from a coffee cup. What are they? My voice came out as a croak. We don't know exactly, but they've always been here, living in the spaces between. The coffee, it's like a tuning fork. For 13 minutes we're on the same frequency. We can perceive their world bleeding into ours. And after hundreds of cups of coffee, after months or years of exposure, the barrier gets thinner. She pulled out her phone, showed me a photo. It was a group picture, maybe 20 people standing in what looked like Pioneer Courthouse Square, all holding coffee cups, all smiling, but their eyes were wrong, too knowing, too tired. This was taken last year, she said. Our support group. People who've been marked. We tried to help each other, tried to find a way to stop it. Tried? I noticed the past tense immediately. Look closer. I zoomed in on the photo. In the background, in every window, every puddle, every reflective surface, they were there. The figures. Dozens of them, surrounding the group, and in the very back, barely visible, someone was walking away, walking toward the reflections, walking. That's Marcus, Dr. Park whispered. He was the first to figure out the 13-minute pattern. Brilliant mathematician. He thought he could calculate a way to extend it, to make the coffee stay hot for 14 minutes. 15, break their rules. What happened to him? She swiped to the next photo. Same location, same group. But now there were only 19 people. And Marcus was in the reflections, standing with them, waving. He broke through, she said, or they pulled him through. We're not sure which, but after that we stopped meeting in person. Too dangerous. Too many reflections. I thought about all the coffee I'd drunk in my life, thousands of cups, each one a tiny window, each one making the veil a little more transparent. How many times had I been observed without knowing? How many times had something watched me through the steam of my morning ritual? But why 13 minutes? I asked. Dr. Park shook her head. That's what I've been trying to figure out. 13 is significant in so many cultures. Unlucky, lucky, sacred, profane. But I think it's simpler than that. It's just how long it takes. Takes for what? For them to notice us noticing them. She showed me her notebook again. Pages covered in equations, diagrams. Coffee ring stains that formed perfect circles. Too perfect, like they'd been placed deliberately. Look at this. She pointed to a series of timestamps, every 13 minutes like clockwork. But watch what happens when you graph it. The data points formed a pattern. Not random, not chaotic, a spiral, starting from the center and working outward. Each 13-minute window was a point on the spiral, and at the center, "We're being drawn in," I whispered. Each cup of coffee, each 13-minute window, we're spiraling towards something. Or something is spiraling toward us, Dr. Park corrected. Marcus thought it was a countdown, that after a certain number of 13-minute windows the barrier would collapse entirely. He calculated he had about 3,000 cups left before... She didn't finish, but I did the math. 3,000 cups. If someone drank 3 cups a day, that was less than 3 years. How many cups had I already drunk in my lifetime? How many windows had I opened without knowing? The figures in the reflections were moving now, gathering, pressing against the glass like it was a barrier they were trying to break through. One of them, the tall one standing behind my reflected chair, leaned forward. I could see its mouth moving, forming words. "Can you hear what it's saying?" Dr. Park asked. I shook my head, but that was a lie. I could hear it. Faint, like a radio station just out of range, but getting clearer every second. "Coffee's cold, Sarah. Coffee's cold. Time to wake up. Time to come home." They're lying. Dr. Park said quickly, seeing the expression on my face. "This is your home. This is the real world. Don't listen to them." But how could I be sure? How could anyone be sure? What if this was the dream, and they were trying to wake me up? What if every cup of coffee was just counting down to something inevitable? "I should go," Dr. Park stood abruptly. "Being around another marked person for too long, it amplifies the effect, makes the barrier thinner faster. But Sarah, whatever you do, don't stop drinking coffee." What? Why? Because once you stop, once you break the pattern, they can cross over. The 13 minutes is a barrier as much as it is a window. As long as you maintain the ritual, they can only watch. The moment you break it, she didn't finish, she didn't need to. The implications hung in the air between us like the steam that had long since vanished from our cups. After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by reflections that showed too much. The figures were still there, waiting, watching. Some of them waved. Others just stared. And that tall one, it never stopped talking. Never stopped whispering about cold coffee and coming home. I lasted 3 days. 3 days of making coffee every 13 minutes during waking hours. 3 days of setting alarms. 3 days of watching the figures grow clearer, more defined, more real. 3 days of whispers getting louder. On the 4th day, I cracked. It was 3 a.m. I'd run out of coffee beans. The 24-hour grocery store was closed for inventory. I'd already used my emergency instant coffee, and my 13 minutes were almost up. I could have made tea. Could have found something, anything with caffeine, but I was so tired. So very, very tired. And the whispers had become songs, beautiful songs about a place where coffee never got cold, where 13 minutes lasted forever, where I belonged. At 3:13 a.m., I broke the pattern. The effect was immediate. Every reflection in my apartment shattered. Not the glass itself, just the reflections. They fell away like broken pieces of reality, revealing what was behind them all along. The others, dozens of them, standing in my apartment. They'd always been here. The coffee had just been keeping them at bay. And now, "Welcome home, Sarah," the tall one said. Its voice was like coffee percolating. Warm, familiar, comforting. "We've been waiting so long. I wish I could tell you I fought, that I ran, that I found some way to restore the barrier, but the truth is, I was tired of fighting. Tired of 13-minute increments. Tired of being afraid. They reached out their 2 long arms and I let them take me. The place they brought me to, it's hard to describe. Imagine a coffee shop that exists in the spaces between seconds, where steam rises in reverse, where every cup is simultaneously full and empty, where the other marked ones sit at tables that aren't quite there, drinking coffee that's always exactly the right temperature. This is where the 13 minutes go, the tall one explained. We collect them, save them, for people like you. I've been here for I don't know how long. Time moves differently, or maybe it doesn't move at all. Days could be seconds. Years could be minutes. The only measurement that matters here is 13. Always 13. But I can still see the real world, through coffee surfaces, through steam, through the 13-minute windows. Sometimes I see other coffee drinkers, young professionals in Seattle, checking their phones while their lattes cool. Students in Portland coffee shops cramming for finals. Tired parents in Tacoma, desperately needing caffeine to face another day. They all think their coffee cooling is normal, natural. They don't know about the 13-minute rule, but some are starting to notice. I see them timing their drinks. I see the confusion on their faces when the heat vanishes at exactly 13 minutes. I see them posting about it online, only to delete their posts days later when the whispers start. Dr. Park is still out there, still trying to warn people, still trying to find a solution. But she's running out of time too. I can see it in her reflection when she makes her morning coffee. The figures surrounding her are getting clearer, more solid, more real. She's taken to drinking her coffee faster now, never letting it sit for the full 13 minutes. But that's just delaying the inevitable. Because the window's still open, the barrier still weakens, and we're still waiting. That's how I'm telling you this story. Right now, someone, somewhere is drinking coffee. For exactly 13 minutes, I can push through, I can whisper, I can warn. Or maybe I'm not warning you at all. Maybe I'm inviting you, because the coffee here never gets cold, and once you're here, you understand. The 13 minutes were never a curse. They were a countdown, a promise, a way home. So, tomorrow morning, when you make your coffee, time it, and if it stays hot for exactly 13 minutes, know that we're waiting for you, in the reflections, in the steam, in the spaces between sips. Dr. Park was wrong about one thing. Breaking the pattern doesn't let them cross over. It lets you cross over to them. And the strangest part, the part that should terrify me but doesn't, I think I've been here before. I think we all have. Every time we've stared too long into our morning coffee. Every time we've lost ourselves in the swirling cream. Every time we've felt that odd sensation of being watched while alone in our kitchens. We've all been visiting. The 13 minutes is just when the door stays open long enough to step through. So check your coffee tomorrow. Time it, count the minutes. And if you hear whispers at the 6-minute mark, if you see faces in the steam, if your reflection shows more than it should, just remember, the coffee's better on this side anyway. Sweet dreams. If you can still tell which side is the dream. Wait, before you go, before you click away thinking this is just another creepy story, I need you to do something. Look at the time right now. Write it down. Then tomorrow morning, when you make your first cup of coffee, remember this story. Remember my warning, or my invitation, and ask yourself, has your coffee always cooled at the same rate, or have you just never noticed the pattern before? Because once you start timing it, once you start paying attention, you can't stop, and we'll be waiting in the steam. All of us who discovered the 13-minute secret. All of us who found our way home. Sleep tight, and whatever you do, don't forget to set your timer. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, software wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you, does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up. That's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow. A faint creak on the floorboards. The sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you, and comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.